Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. Best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year. We do private weekly group Zoom chats for members only, where we shoot the breeze on world events. I also bring back past podcast guests once in a while to do a live Q&A with supporters only. And I do a weekly roundup of the news and commentary, which people are very much enjoying. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, Bitcoin. Thank you, whoever sent me a fraction of Bitcoin over the weekend. And you can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about anything. And do check out all of my affiliates. There's a whole bunch of them: Wise Wolf Gold, Escape the Technocracy, Above Phone, and others. And please do leave a podcast review on Apple or Spotify. I've recently gotten 3 one-star reviews in a row almost daily. That's never happened before. I think someone is out to get me. So if you appreciate the podcast and you haven't already, just take a few moments of your time to log into your Apple iTunes account on your Windows or Apple machine and leave a genuine, an honest review. And joining us for the first time is Fergus Hodgson, who's a New Zealand native, also a citizen of Canada and Ireland, a triple citizen like myself. He was the founding editor-in-chief of the PanAm Post, is founder and director of Econ Americas, a consultancy devoted to international finance, geopolitical risk, and jurisdictional arbitrage. He's also the publisher of the Impunity Observer. He's traveled to 19 of 20 nations in Latin America, and is the author of the Latin America Red Pill, My Search for Freedom South of the Border. I've got the Kindle version right here, which you can buy now in digital format or physical. It's not, it's a bit blurry thanks to the camera. But anyways, welcome, Fergus, to Geopolitics and Empire.
Oh, it's my privilege, mate. I'm eager to digest this with you. And I don't know whether we're going to agree or disagree, but you obviously have a great international pedigree, so it makes for an exciting discussion.
Yeah, and I first heard of you thanks to our mutual friend Jose Nino. Shout out to Jose. And I got your book, Latin America Red Pill. And I have to say, by and large, I've been in Mexico for over a decade. I became a Mexican citizen. By and large, yes, I cannot disagree with you. And maybe we can get to this in our chat. I would just add that there are exceptions. Maybe there are some nuances, but I can't really disagree with you. And maybe just to start off for people, give us, what is your red pill on Latin America? Your central thesis, because there's many people expatriating to Latin America. They view it as sort of a paradise. You kind of don't think so, and you've got the street cred. 19 out of 20 countries that you've lived in Latin America. You've spent, I think, 15 plus years there. So, what's the central thesis here? The red pill.
Sure. If those not familiar with the red pill, that is the unsavory truth, as opposed to the savory or pleasant lie. And the pleasant lie is that Latin America's problems are the fault of outsiders, of foreigners, and that Latin America just has to basically grow out of, let's say the colonial era or of US interventionism or whatever it may be, or corrupt rulers, and suddenly will become this wellspring of creativity. And the red pill is that, no, Latin America's problems are bottom up. Of course, that doesn't mean that foreigners have helped the situation, but the red pill is the depth of the challenges in the region and how they are so widespread and consistent that they're not an accident. They stem from deep-rooted problems in the actual people themselves, the bottom up problems.
I was going to save this for the end, but I thought now would be a good time to bring it up. Again, yes. I would say that I wouldn't really disagree with you. I've struggled with what you just said, that it's a bottom-up problem.
Yes.
But as an American and well aware of American empire and a lot of the bad things that the hegemony that's been carried out as a result of U.S. empire and bullying, regime changes, and an oligarchy in London, sure, Brussels, and Washington. How much would you give when you compare percentages to the geopolitical factor? Your thoughts on American interventions? I would view regime changes as undemocratic and unethical, and oftentimes they are for oligarchic corporate international interests. And so just your thought on the bottom up versus what portion of influence there is from
Yeah,
U.S.
that's such a
intervention?
that's such a difficult question because U.S. intervention has waned over the years, and some intervention on net might have been for the better, right? So whether it was in Panama in the late 80s, early 90s, whether it was in Grenada, so I would give it almost zero, right? There's been negative intervention and there's been positive. Obviously, I write about in the book the intervention in Nicaragua, which I thought was a grave negative. And there have been other flops or failures that were almost non-interventions. So the most prominent one is Venezuela, where the US could have assisted with the removal of Hugo Chavez in 2002 and did not. Now, this is not in my book. I mean, there are too many things to cover, but I know personally people who were involved with removing Chavez from power. And at the time, the United States could have peacefully supported a transitional government, and they did not. And instead, Fidel Castro worked with the Venezuelan military to have Hugo Chavez restored to power. And we are living with another 20 years of insanity because of that. So, that's a very complex question. So this is one of the immediate, and you kind of did go for the jugular, but this is one of the immediate challenges I have bringing this story to the United States, because people of the Anglosphere, and especially the United States, have a great deal of, I wouldn't say self-hatred, but willingness to accept blame or take the blame for problems around the world. And people will say, oh, it's the CIA, they're overturning all these governments. I say, well, did the CIA go down to Central America and force a third of women to be married underage? Did the CIA go down there and lower the region's IQ to about 80? They had nothing to do with that, right? So, we want to blame these shadowy institutions without concrete evidence of their meddling. And the disparities are so enormous. And this got me very frustrated, this blaming of foreign meddling, because when I was in Venezuela, there have been these huge protests against the dictatorship. I mean, millions upon millions of people on the streets. And everyone wants to say, oh, it's some kind of CIA plan. I'm going, I know all these people myself. They don't have anything to do with the CIA. They're out protesting because they don't like the dictatorship. And the thing is, one of the inspirations for this book was a guy called Carlos Rangel, a Venezuelan who wrote The Latin Americans, and in Spanish it was From the Good Revolutionary to the Good Savage, no, From the Good Savage to the Good Revolutionary, back in the 70s. And back in the 70s, 50 years ago, all the dictators were blaming the CIA then. It's the oldest excuse in the book for your own failure. I wrote, one of the chapters in the book is about how Venezuela, I think 6 reasons or 10 reasons, I can't remember, about why Venezuela has real socialism and how they destroyed their own economy. Yet they still want to blame sanctions, which initially and probably still are only targeted against specific individuals, for their own failures. You can't win. The United States doesn't want to fight Latin America. And I say this to people too. Okay, so let's say the US is going through an extended decline in its international power and influence. And now China is basically, if not already, very soon will be the dominant force in Latin America. Do you think Latin America is going to get richer because of Chinese involvement and the US just retreating out of there? Get out of here. Nothing will change. In fact, it'll get worse. So the smart countries will still align with the United States as long as they can, where they have at least some better institutions and better trade. And the counter to my book, which I refer to in the introduction, is The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan. And he is the poster child for blaming all of Latin America's backwardness. And he was even very open about Latin America's failures. So in some ways, he was before political correctness. So he kind of didn't couch it in such gentle words. He blamed it on the foreigners, but basically the way he couched it, it was impossible. Whether you trade or didn't trade or invested or didn't invest, either way, you're to blame for their problems. And so I get very frustrated about it because look, I agree the US has had some negative involvement in Latin America, but it's been a relatively benign force in the region. And that's why when countries like Ecuador dollarize, or El Salvador, I mean, it helps them. It doesn't hurt them. The US, look, I have as much animosity as probably anyone towards Washington, D.C., right? I favor secession, whatever. But the thing is that there are many worse actors in global government and politics than the people in D.C.
And maybe we can use as a further example in your book. You talk at length about Cuba, and
Yes.
I attend a church here in Mexico, and the church works with pastors and churches in Cuba, and I have close Mexican friends here who've gone multiple times in recent months and years to Cuba, and we're getting on the ground reports from Cubans that are in rural Cuba, not the touristy Havana that you experience, and they say that it's apocalyptic. And so you've got these Cubans and Mexicans saying, there's no, there's no communications because there's no electricity. You can't charge your phone. Fridge doesn't work.
Sure.
Food is going bad. No meat. Nothing. It's like total end of the world scenario. And they kind of say, they ask me, like, who do you think is the bad guy? Is it the Cuban regime or is it the U.S. sanctions? And I kind of am forced to admit, by their own admission, they're basically saying like people literally can't eat on Cuba. It's apocalypse. And I'm forced to admit, I think the Cuban regime should just throw in the hat, call it a day, and let America come in, because at least people will be able to eat. I mean, I think this is the latest example where things are just that bad. I mean, your further thoughts.
Let me clarify. People need to know a bit more about Cuba. The sanctions on Cuba do not apply to food and medicine. Okay. Further, when I traveled to Cuba, who was putting on the barrier? Was it the US or was it Cuba? The Cuban regime had exorbitant taxes and very limited luggage restrictions on what I could bring to Cuba. It was them. They have this stupid billboard up near the airport. Oh, and the bloqueo. The bloqueo is killing us. No, you idiots. You can trade with any country on the world, but you're a bunch of communist psychos. And you blame everyone else for your own misgivings. The truth is, anyone who knows Cuban history knows that Fidel Castro thought he was going to bring some flourishing economy with U.S. help or not. Still, even with these supposed sanctions, which are very limited, the fact is that U.S. is still the major trading partner with Cuba. Fidel Castro thought he was so smart, he was going to tell the farmers what to grow and they'd make more money. This is the arrogance of such a man. And so it is 100% the fault. And in fact, it's really the tragedy that the US was not more involved. They abandoned the Bay of Pigs scenario because they were too afraid of being, we're going to be the imperialistas. We're going to be blamed for all the problems. No, get this dictator out of there. This is where, there's a chapter in here on libertarians, because I have a very non-interventionist sentiment. I don't want to get involved in other countries and assume we're going to socially engineer them. But the fact is, we have other foreign actors engineering them for us. We leave a power vacuum. So that's why I advocate a new Monroe Doctrine, where the US does not engage with Latin America basically at all, or in a very limited fashion. But the US does keep out other disruptive forces. It's obvious that the Soviets, not my best friends, were in Cuba and building a dictatorship, and they wanted an ally. And, so it wasn't some neutral, groundswell of support. Further, even the people who fought with Fidel Castro for independence, such as Uber Matos, who I mentioned in the book, he defected from the regime as soon as he realized that it was not going to be democratic, and Fidel Castro put him in prison for 22 years. And my chapter on Cuba, I've got many discussions of Cuba, but Cuba is a nation of lies. The regime lives on lies. They cannot let the truth out. The truth is, it's a communist disaster, and only useful idiots support them. And unfortunately, there are plenty of useful idiots who buy into this myth of egalitarianism or some kind of socialist paradise. It's ridiculous. You have Spanish nut jobs coming to Cuba. There's a great essay on this called The Last Communist City, discussing all these tourists coming into see the communist island. I'm going, are you nuts? These people are prisoners, modern day slaves. It is a tragedy. And to be frank, it's an embarrassment that the US let this happen right next door. So the whole reason the Bad Pigs failed was because the US wanted to pretend it wasn't involved, when of course it was involved. It arranged for the training in Guatemala, from the liftoff from Nicaragua, and it just abandoned these guys to die and be taken prisoner in Cuba. And I have absolutely no love for any of these Cuban parasites or dictatorship, insiders. I think they deserve, they deserve the worst of punishments.
Yeah, and I'm saying, I can't disagree with you. This podcast was born out of my dislike. I'm born in the USA and did my dislike for American empire. But
Yeah.
I can't disagree with you. And, in the last months, we've seen reports of even Cuban members of the Cuban regime and security apparatus themselves fleeing for the United
They
States.
go and live in Miami. Yeah, I'm going. What?
And in our church recently, we had Christians from Cuba who left Cuba. It was a husband and wife, and they had a child. And they were in our church while they were waiting for their papers to enter the U.S. And now they're in Florida. And I was getting direct testimony from these Cubans themselves, confirming what you are saying. And so again, it's not about so much the empire, that the situation is like, yeah, guy, Fidel Castro regime, go home and let's start anew, because it's absolutely.
I have a really hard time pronouncing your name, but let me
Curvoye.
Let me be charitable here, because in many ways, this sort of foreign policy of half measures is destructive. I mean, I don't want to get stuck in the Ukraine situation, but either fight a war or don't. With the case with Cuba, either remove the dictatorship or don't. This sort of dilly-dallying and coming up with some stupid, Radio Marti, this kind of government propaganda exercise is a big waste of time and probably does more harm than good. So I don't, this is where I would say that the US has had a lack of maybe leadership or decisiveness on these issues, where either you engage and confront and try to actually do something, or you let trade flow and some kind of natural development occur. But this kind of stalemate for 60 years plus is obviously not leading to much.
Yeah, and again, as I say, with the primary source, the Cubans themselves are fleeing like mad, and they're saying it's hell on earth, and so it's like that.
Well, when you send sports teams abroad and half of them just like run away, what does that tell you? Like even the privileged kind of like cocooned athletes don't want to be in Cuba, don't want their children to grow up there. So and you said, as you noted, if even the regime insiders, the part of the very tight ruling clique, don't want to be there, who the hell does, right? So, like you said, and we're just lucky that that the Soviet Union folded so that Cuba didn't keep taking over other countries, because we know that Cuba was behind Nicaragua's overthrow, that even Che Guevara died in Bolivia trying to overthrow their government. They had some kind of insane quest to turn all of Latin America into Cuba.
Yeah, and even North Korea, you're seeing an increase, I've noticed in the last year or so, increased number of North Korean foreign diplomats, what do you call it, defecting. One of them actually through Cuba, I believe. Oh. And let me ask you then about, one of the big red pills on Latin America, and again, I have to agree. I had Ed Calderon on the podcast a while back. He's been on Joe Rogan. He's a former Mexican police officer, and he's one of the go-to guys when you ask about Mexico and narcos and all that. And I asked him, the solution. He's like, there's no solution. Things are just so bad. Like we've tried everything. We don't know what to do. And you talk about security and crime. You write, quote, "After living in Argentina and Guatemala and traveling to 17 other Latin American countries, I describe what most of these countries exhibit as the law of the jungle. This entails two criteria: a violent criminal proclivity in the population and a corrupt, absent, and or incompetent police force. Life there carries less value as murder is commonplace." And this is very rooted here. I live in a gated community. You talk about those in your book. I went to Costa Rica many years ago with my wife, and one thing I noticed, we landed in the capital, we rented a car, we drove to a beach. It was a German-owned hotel. The guy had been there for 20 years. And when I parked my rent-a-car, it's a small beach town in Costa Rica, I noticed in the evening, there was a local sitting on a chair outside the lot, and I'm like, okay, that's low trust. He's making sure the cars don't get broken into or stolen. And I'm just thinking, seriously. And so your thoughts on this very deep rooted, situation of crime, which it's a low trust society, high crime, and I just don't see it being resolved.
No, I don't either. And well, like I said, I do describe it as the law of the jungle, and I have a chapter on that specifically, which was motivated by what happened here in Colorado, where Tren de Aragua came. And it's hard to assess how widespread or deep their involvement is in the United States now. but I hear they're in a bunch of different states, and basically they're extorting property owners. Now, so I make the estimate that Latin America's murder rate is about 5 times what it is in Canada and the United States, and probably higher than that. So now, of course, it's much worse if you're a man. Men are murdered about 5 times the rate of women. So if you're a woman in Mexico, for example, you have about the same murder rate as an American, just regular American. But if you're a man, it's about 5 times. So anyway, so it is gendered, but it seems to be something that really fits Latin America and pretty much follows Latin America wherever she goes, right? So if you go to Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, and you rent a vehicle and you go to Vieques, locals tell you don't lock your cars, because if you do, they'll just smash the windows. It's better that they just can open the door and get your stuff if they're going to try to steal from you. There are a million anecdotes like this. Now, if you want to know what that kind of crime is like, there's somewhat of a corollary in a place like New Orleans, where the crime in New Orleans would be comparable to a city in Latin America. New Orleans has a very confusing history, mostly black population. It's a port city, so there's been a lot of kind of like coming and going or itinerant people. It is an extremely corrupt government. I mean, it's just a disastrous place, to be frank, even though I've been there many times and lived there for a year. Now, locals, if they have to stay there, right? They'll fortify wherever they live and arm themselves and everything like that. But in general, they'll just escape, right? There's a huge flight to Mandeville on the North Shore, or people just leaving the area entirely. So, like I said, I don't see an easy solution. It would require an incredibly aggressive and probably civil rights destroying approach to really limit that. And the bottom-up approach is just being to hire a ton of security guards and to build gated communities.
And, one thing I've had on, you might be familiar with Emmanuel Rincon from Venezuela.
Oh, yeah, he's a popular guy. Yeah. I think he's been on, yeah, go ahead.
He's been on the podcast. He lives in Florida, I think. And I think Maduro recently actually specifically threatened him some months back. And something that I think he mentioned that in Latin America, you touch on it as well, that amongst the populists themselves, even amongst some conservatives, they still have this subtle collectivist way of thinking, sort of leftist, big government. You talk about that, the nanny state.
Yes.
And I had a conversation with an elderly Mexican some months back here in Guadalajara, where she was telling me in her neighborhood, someone was having a party and a bunch of guys with guns came to the home and robbed people. And I'm trying to explain to her, I'm like, well, look, if there are restrictive gun laws here in Mexico, and I said, well, look, if we were allowed to be armed legally and shoot these robbers, let's say we've all got guns and they come in and you shoot a couple and they die or get injured, then the next robbers will think twice, and slowly you'll have a diminishing quantity of robberies and problem solved.
Yeah.
And yet every time I brought this up to most Mexicans, they have this aversion to guns. And I'm just thinking, like, they just won't do away with this sort of collectivist mindset of deferring to the state. And I think, just can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great, so there's so much to say about that. I mean, like you said, we all know, anyone who's lived in Latin America has firsthand accounts or, very close accounts, these anecdotes. I mean, when I lived in Argentina, if you just leave your home for a few hours, someone's going to notice and break into your home, basically. I mean, it's really tough. My friend was robbed at gunpoint in Ecuador. I mean, I witnessed a robbery firsthand. I mean, it's just everywhere. So, okay. Gun rights are an incredibly meaningful, let's say, policy or topic, because the strong view that you have the moral, standing to defend yourself with violence or whatever, and including by arming yourself, is not widespread around the world. It seems to be pretty unique to basically, at this point in the time of the world, to the mountain states of the United States, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Alberta up in Canada, that part of the world is the most cowboyish, or we will stand up for ourselves. Almost anywhere else on the planet, there's not a strong sense that you can arm yourself to defend yourself. And not for hunting or anything like that, but self-defense. Even in New Zealand, where I'm from, even in the rural areas, there wouldn't be that strong a support for it. Basically, gun rights is, in my opinion, the strongest predictor of a self-ruling mentality. You are your own king, and you'll defend yourself, and no one is going to tell you otherwise. And it's very hard to convey that to people who just don't have the mentality. Now, whether arming all the Latin Americans would lower crime, probably, but like as you said, in general they don't have it. Now, among the oligarchs or empresarios of Latin America, many of whom I admire, there's a split. Now, most of them do have some crony protections. That's just the way of life, right? When you live in a crony economy, it's hard to get ahead. There aren't very many Peter Thiels out there. Or John Mackey's, two of my heroes in terms of entrepreneurs. But many of the oligarchs are literate, well-educated, and they actually do have a strong sense for classical liberalism. And they will be friends with each other and friends with me. And they have almost a European understanding of the world, you might say. And there are others who are just, in my view, basically 100% corruptos. So there's a rift there. There is definitely a well-established aristocratic and intellectual class in Latin America who I think are doing the best they can, and I respect them. And they would probably support gun rights. But they are obviously, they're not even a majority. Maybe they're a majority of the oligarchs or ruling class, but they're definitely not a majority of the people in general.
And before moving away from the security issue, I when I first came to Mexico, my home, I rented a home that was not in a gated community, and it was within the span of 2 years, it was burglarized 3 times, and it's just as you said, they watch when you leave. Then they come in. I've had my car's window smashed in, and I've even had where I used to work a coworker that was kidnapped. He survived, thankfully. I've had parents of students kidnapped because they were wealthy families, and just your thought. We got Claudia Sheinbaum now in the president of Mexico. You talk about AMLO in your book. And she's talking about some security solution. And, the thing that really gets me, I think you touch on that as well lately, particularly in Mexico, is how much organized crime, cartels, narcos are destroying the country for everyone. 50 semi-trucks are hijacked daily. When you talk about extortion, I mean, again, from my church, one of my friends from church, his brother is on the run from narcos. Okay, he was involved with narcos, but another friend from church, he was hired to open a small business here in Mexico. The next day, 2 guys come to extort, to ask for piso, the mafia tax. Right. Yeah. They were lucky. They basically said, look, we're Christians, we're not paying this, and they went away. I mean, they just got lucky, I guess, but sometimes that happens. But, I hear my cleaning lady used to have a business. She was demanded, extorted, and she stopped her business and now is cleaning houses. Yeah. And so you hear these stories from all socioeconomic levels in Mexico. And we'll talk about later. There are exceptions. I've still been here for over a decade, and I'm fine. But just your thoughts on when someone like Scheinbaum talks about solutions. What any thought?
So solutions to the crime, right? There are many, but they're all politically incorrect, right? They don't fit the progressive narrative. So the immediate solution, or it wouldn't fix it, but it would help, would be to basically have local anti-Maro or anti-narco militias, which have been put to good effect in places like El Salvador and in Guatemala. So if the local villages feel that there are outsiders who are bad actors, and the local villages can basically arm themselves to fight, they will outnumber the narcos. And maybe they won't be as brutal, but just by numbers, they can win. Now, okay, so like I said, a kind of like a bottom-up arming of the populace would be a healthy thing. And I know, especially in Ecuador, where I've spent plenty of time, there's a strong sense in the country that the narcos or the most violent people are not from Ecuador. that this was not always a problem there. But it has become a problem in the last 25 years. I don't really know. But basically, the Colombians spread into Ecuador, and then everyone else started arriving. And there would be a strong, let's say, local push to violently resist. The other thing is that what's one? I'm sure you've been to San Miguel de Allende in Mexico.
Yeah.
It is basically an island of the United States in Mexico, where tons of Americans and Canadians have been there for a long, long time. I mean, apparently it goes back to the 1940s, 1950s that Americans started going there. You've basically imported a bunch of Americans and their practices to that part of Mexico. And now Mexicans love it. They will go there, right? They love to go there. So that's why I have proposed or supported initiatives to bring Anglo-Saxon people and institutions to Latin America. And even in Honduras, there's the example of the Bay Islands, Roatan, where they speak English. And really, the Bay Islands shouldn't be part of Honduras. It's kind of an accident that they're more like Belize, where they have more of an English history. They speak English. It's more prosperous. All the cruise ships go there. It's almost not Honduras, right? So now, whether that would be successful, I mean, it might take a while, but to me, you have to bring in businesses, institutions, people who just simply will not accept this kind of behavior. And that's tough because the first few people have to stick their neck out. There's a famous guy, John Corbin, he's from California originally, but he's an American who renounced citizenship and now lives in Chile. And he thought Chile would make him freer than the United States. That was a mistake. And now he's being sent. I don't know if he's still in prison. I think he is. But during riots in 2019, he got sent to prison because he was driving through a bunch of protesters and he got out his gun to defend himself and shot some guy in the leg. And that was enough to get him sentenced to prison, right? So he was one guy who still had this American thinking where, I can defend myself with arms if I want to, but that didn't work out in the Chilean courts. Now, I have friends like you. I've got 2 American friends who live in San Miguel de Allende and a Canadian friend, and they prefer, let's say, a different pace of life. So some people have made it work for them. But in terms of the crime, I recognize it. I don't see an easy solution. And even gated communities, unfortunately, have limited ability to stop this because people within the gated communities will rob you or they'll jump the fence. So they just seem to be, they'll help. But there's one of the in the back of the book, I recommended other essays or resources. And there's a great essay about all the gated communities in Argentina. And they discuss how even in these fancy gated communities, they still struggle with crime, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've lived after my home was robbed initially, I moved to a gated community, and like literally the next day or a week later, I happened to be at the edge of the wall, and over the wall was a field, and someone jumped the wall and robbed my new neighbor who came knocking on my door. And
man.
But in the gated community where I live now, initially when it was still developing and we didn't have the full walls and protection, you'd get a few people come in. But now, as of late, like we're a good gated community, and there haven't been issues. I mean, here's another. I mean, I can tell this crazy story. This happened a year or 2 ago or 3. One day I saw military pass through our gated community. I'm thinking like this is not normal, and apparently there had been organized crime or narco living in the gated community, causing a ruckus. Sure. The guy was even calling our security and telling them to go to the 7-Eleven in front and buy him stuff, and he wouldn't even pay. And the security is like so afraid because it's like a organized crime narco member, and he'd go to the Oxo 7-Eleven, whatever, bring him. I mean, they would order takeaway food, which would be delivered, and they wouldn't pay, and like no one would do anything. And he was even brutalizing women, and the women were running out of the gated community to the community.
Which gated community was this? Yours.
Here in Colorado. And
You're man, you're really kind of selling my book's point here, to be frank. Tough.
well, but, yeah, right. And then the woman went into the convenience store. They locked her in, and the guy was smashing up the windows. And again, authorities did nothing. Eventually, someone who knew someone in the military or police, they ended up getting these guys kicked out of the gated community. Except for that, situation, by and large, our community is fine. Nothing has happened. But again, I'm trying to be brutally honest here and objective. This goes against my own, right, perhaps desires or perceptions that I want to sell. But I always want to talk about the truth, no matter how brutal it is, on the podcast. Maybe I thought this was interesting since you brought up, I think, Honduras. You mentioned in your book this private a development that was attempted in Honduras. The government originally signed yes, and now they want to. I guess the government changed, and now they want to cancel it. And you say there's no way you think it's going to succeed, and I probably agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. This is an important part of the book and an important part of my journey through Latin America, and I'm glad you brought it up, mate. And I appreciate your candor, because in many ways we've both faced these challenges, because we've been in Latin America for a long time, and we've felt these things up close and personal. Okay, back in 2009, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Honduran history. Honduras has barely had stability ever, but in 2009, the incumbent president wanted to call a referendum to change the constitution to allow re-election. And he was also a buddy of Hugo Chavez, and this is not a secret. It's just well known that he had socialist tendencies, or even if it wasn't really ideological socialism, he was allied with them. So basically, the military came to his place and in his pajamas and took him out, handcuffed him or whatever, took him in and dropped him off in Costa Rica. So there was a removal of the president in 2009. You can call it many things, a coup or a constitutional protection, because he was basically going to post a referendum, which I think the Supreme Court at the time had ruled was unconstitutional. So he was basically just defying the rule of law. So someone had to kind of do something about it. Anyway, so he got kicked out. And then in the aftermath, there was a little bit of chaos. I've met the guy who was president after him, who was at the time president of the Congress. So he stepped in to be president of Honduras. This is Roberto Micheletti. Great man, as far as I can tell. And then there was an election held for another one, Porfirio Lobos Sosa, from memory. And somehow, for some providence, some smart Hondurans and American entrepreneurs come up with this idea, which is basically like a free trade zone on steroids, right? Which would have given much more autonomy to certain approved regions of Honduras. So there would kind of be an application process. You can say, I'm going to have this area and this governance structure is complicated, and this form of taxation. And there'd be more autonomy for things like, yes, taxation and arbitration. That's crucial. So independent courts from the Honduran courts. And these are called originally charter cities. And a New York University economist, Romer, I can't remember his first name. Anyway, but there was a New York University economist who was quite well known, who backed this. But it went through different iterations. It was called leap zones, and finally ZEDE, zones for employment and economic development and employment. Anyway, this had, even though there are trade zones or special tax zones all across Latin America, including in Honduras, this one had the tinge of American branding, and which was not inaccurate. Obviously, there were Americans involved. I thought it was a great thing. And at the time, I was kind of at my peak anarcho-capitalist sentiments. And I was going, this is amazing. We're going to have this kind of like new region. We can build from scratch. It's incredible. And I went to Honduras in 2013 to explore this. 2013, 2014? No. Anyway, 2013. Anyway, so, however, when I went there, I quickly realized that, man, that the chaos would make any sort of implementation of this extremely difficult. Let's say, because the first night I arrived, there was no power all across San Pedro Sula. At the time, San Pedro Sula was known as the murder capital of the world. So, but people were so accustomed to power outages, or in Spanish, no tiene, no luz, like the lack of light. And we went to a restaurant, they served us, they had candles, they cooked the meat, everything was great, even without electricity. They were so kind of accustomed to handling this. Anyway, what happened is that Juan Orlando Hernandez got in and he supported the ZEDEs. So that president supported the ZEDEs. However, he applied for some kind of human rights exemption to get re-election, which doesn't make any sense. I want to use stronger language, but hypocrisy would describe it, that the military literally removed Manuel Zelaya, or Mel Zelaya, over re-election, and then they let the National Party president have re-election. It shows you the kind of confusion in the legal system there. And then he got, I don't know whether it was him exactly, and maybe he was just targeted for retribution, but his nephew, close family members were tied up in drug transportation, narco activities. And so he's now in prison in New York State, as far as I know, the former president. And anyway, so there was a fracture in the other party. I'm trying to cut the story down. There are a lot of details here, but the socialists got back into power. So the guy who got kicked out of the country in 2009, his wife is now president of Honduras. And one of the chief objectives of this administration has been to cancel any hint of the special zones that would have built basically first world legal and taxation structures in Honduras and been a boon. And they were a boon for investment while they were in existence. So they don't exist as far as I can tell. They try to exist, but recently there's whatever constitutional basis was removed, and there was also some kind of legal decision which retroactively banned them for all, making them a legal non-entity. And one of the businesses that was in existence was invaded for tax evasion, I think, just recently, which really drove the point home that it's over. And I just thought, this is really sad to me because I was excited about first world institutions going to Honduras and building a kind of like a little Singapore in Central America. And it didn't happen. And the Hondurans, both the people at large and the ruling class, did not want it. And so they missed a great opportunity.
Yeah, that struck me when you mentioned that. And again, I probably have to agree with you. Like, it probably won't succeed. I mean, that's something as well I learned.
They're hanging on. They're trying. They're hoping that another guy will get elected next year and they can somehow reignite this. I mean, gosh, it's a Hail Mary attempt at this point.
I want to switch again back to culture, the cultural dimension in Latin America, which you discuss. And again, I feel I can't disagree. I want to give just two personal examples. I reckon from your reading that, there's this culture of corruption, and I would call it mediocrity. In the U.S. and parts of Europe, you have this high trust. You call it low time preference versus here is this low trust, I guess, high time or no time.
High time preference means you want things now. You're not willing to wait for the future. Go ahead.
Yeah, and just examples that I had. I taught in the U.S. I've seen from immigrants themselves. My father was a immigrant from Yugoslavia, Croatia in the 80s, and my mother as well. He became a painter. He excelled at his work. He took great pride in his work, and he tried to be the best at what he could do. I worked at a supermarket when I was a teenager in North Chicago. The owners were two Greek cousins who were children of Greek, I think, immigrants. And again, when I worked there, my bosses, I became a manager eventually, but they espoused against this excellence. I was one of the best workers, which is why I became manager. Even after I got held up at gunpoint in Chicago, they gave me a $1 raise. They didn't want to lose me because I was such an honest worker. And so this, in America in general, in the West, there's this culture of excelling at whatever it is that you do. And then when I used to work here in Mexico teaching, I was trying to do the same. I was innovating. I was Skyping, just like this podcast was born out of me Skyping experts into the classroom.
Great.
I'm Skyping in John Perkins, the economic hitman,
Oh, really?
to my international relations students to take them on today. And then so I'm doing like going beyond what's the word, the pale here, and then I'm implementing gamification, ed tech. Like I'm going crazy with it. It's so much fun. The kids are loving it. I have one of my supervisors then come to me and say, you know what? You're making the other teachers look bad. You need to tone it down. And that's basically like telling me that, look, it's mediocrity here. You're putting your head above the parapet. Is that crab in the bucket mentality, trying to pull you down?
Yes.
That's one example. And then when I go to the supermarkets, again, I was a cashier. I did everything in the supermarket. I'm scanning people in 5 seconds. You're scanned. Pay me. I'm trying to excel, like speed. You go to the convenience stores here, the supermarkets, huge lines. There's 2 cashiers. They won't open the second register. They're just taking their time. You can wait. And I'm just thinking this is a cultural thing. Again, and it's not across the board. I've met Mexicans or Latin Americans that are doing really well. They're excelling. But I feel there's a greater portion about in Mexico, for example, of people that just are okay with mediocrity. Just your thoughts on some of these cultural red pills.
I mean, I remember when I was in Venezuela and I was with a local priest, and we just went to a cafe to catch up, and you would order your food in one place, pay for it in another place, and pick it up at another place. And it was chaos. And we just thought, what is going on here? Right? It was very confusing. And then I think when you ordered, you couldn't actually really see what food was available because of like all the chaos. And so sometimes the food that you had ordered wasn't there. And we just thought, this doesn't make any sense. And anyone who's done shopping in Latin America will know that this is it's a common thing. That there's just like the way you pay and pick up things just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's very wasteful and time consuming. And one of my buddies in Paraguay, he just said, Ferg, we're just used to waiting in lines. It's just kind of part of the gig here. And okay, I write about this I've got one chapter, and I'm not sure whether you got through this one, but it's more of one of the spicier chapters about my time at university in Guatemala. And it really left a bad taste in my mouth because, as you know, I've been a big advocate for market liberalization and just the classical liberal libertarian community in Latin America. And many of them are still my best friends. It's wonderful. I mean, I want to go back all the time. I went to Universidad Francisco Marroquín University as part of a double degree or doble titulación program with Tulane University in Louisiana. And there's I've got a lot of the detail in the chapter, and it's not a secret, but basically I pulled out of the program after about 6 months, after going through a few courses and just realizing that everyone was cheating and it was just a big joke. And the level of cheating we have cheating problem here in the United States, to be frank, but it was just so over the top. I was just thinking, what, does anyone even care about anything here? I don't really get it. Because we had take-home exams that people would just bring to class and work on together in front of the instructors. And we also had a professor just give us an exam and then walk home and leave us to work on the exam together, basically to hand it in the next day. And that's when I just said, oh, forget it, I'm leaving this place. And the way they treated me was very eye-opening, that I was the problem. I was the one who was I was disrupting the flow of things because I said, I can't, this isn't right. And at the same time, I wasn't learning anything because basically people would have the answers to last year's exams and they'd work on them together because one person would have kind of collected it and then they'd kind of share it. And I just thought, why are we even doing this? I don't get it, right? Also, the tall, what we call it, this crab in the bucket scenario, we call it the tall poppy syndrome back in New Zealand, where the poppy that stands tall, we cut it down. And I just thought this school could be, more competitive on the international level. And I was exactly the kind of guy who could have helped that. And they just didn't care. They just thought, well, we're supposedly the best in Guatemala. And I thought, does anyone really care about that? Only in your little world does that actually matter to anybody. And but I just realized that I wasn't going to change it, and that you should not go to Latin America expecting their, let's say, low trust society, or you can call it mediocrity if you want to, but unwillingness to engage in innovation or whatever. You can't expect it to change for you. I mean, that's why one of my friends just said, "Ferg, you need to leave Guatemala," and I said, "Yeah." There were so many other occurrences that made me leave, but I just like you said, that's the way it is. It's deep rooted, and that's why let's say the best of the elites stick together. They form their own little communities.
Yeah, and I would just probably add from my view, you mentioned New Zealand tall poppy syndrome, and
Yeah.
I would just say that this is universal, I guess, defect of human nature or sin, but because I guess of different variables in different geographies, maybe it's more emphasized and less. And again, I would argue where I used to teach, I loved where I worked, the Tec de Monterrey.
Yeah.
And that's where the wealthy send their kids, and it goes back to what you're saying earlier, where there's more development. You have more of these standards, and so there was less cheating. There was still cheating at the Tech, and we battled it, but it was less compared to where other places that I've worked. And I actually failed students. Like the pass was 70%, and I had students that got a 68 or 69. They would come and beg, and I'd be like, "Sorry, these are the rules. It would be unethical for me to pass you at 69," and I failed them. And the Tech stood behind me, and that was an example of rules being applied, morality, justice being applied. And I would just, even with the transit police, I've had fun with the Mexican transit police where, I had a car, long story, but it ended up being, I've told this story, I think once before in the podcast. It was an illegal car, US plates. And it was a week before I'm moving to Kazakhstan, 2017. And the transit police stops me and he wants a bribe. And I felt so good. I was like, I don't pay bribes. And I'm like, I tell him in Spanish, I'm like, take the car. I'm like, take it. And he's standing there and he doesn't want to do the paperwork. It's work to call the towing and do the paperwork. Yeah. He wants money from me now. He doesn't say it, but I know that's what he wants. And I'm with gusto. I'm like, take it, llévalo. And he's staring at me. He's like, well, what's he going to do with this crazy foreigner? I show him, like, he probably thinks I'm lying. I take my passport with the visa. I'm like, look, in 1 week, I got a visa for Kazakhstan. I'm leaving. Take the car. And he's like, I'll buy it from you. So I end up extracting money from the transit police, and so he buys it from me, and he pulls out literally a wad of cash. I'd probably say easily 100,000 pesos cash in his pocket. And so I'm like, I'm not paying a bribe, and I forced him to buy my car, which was gonna sell it to the secretary at work. But just on the inverse, though, I think there are good things, in America, for example, that are good, but I would say there are also sort of inverses here where sometimes I feel in the US or parts of Europe, I think it's even worse in Croatia actually than the US, where people view you, they qualify you as a human based on your bank account status and your social status. And if you're not, somebody like a high social currency or financial currency, they kind of like, I don't care about you. Where in Mexico, or Latin America, I think people genuinely see you more as a human being. Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. But I mean, there's so much I can say about it. But about a year and a half ago, I caught up with an Irishman. I'm an Irish citizen. My grandparents both grew up there, whatever. I've been there, spent plenty of time there. But there's the British Isles, which I'm obviously a big fan of. I'm proud to be British Isles ancestry. We had more of a high trust, low time preference society or civilization. And one of the good things about that is that you care about character more. Particularly in the rural or agrarian communities, that a person's character matters so much more than what he has or does not have. So there's much more emphasis on substance over style. And that is still one thing that I struggle to come to grips with in the United States, that this Irish gentleman and I were just chatting about it, how he said to me, Ferg, you're from a different world, that you don't seem to realize that in the United States, there is much more of an emphasis on your economic status. Now, of course, just like you, we like to make money and be innovative. That's great, but we don't like to be judged by that, right? We see that as a distraction from deeper things that are more important. And but my personal view is that Latin Americans are very class conscious, and I mean, I write this in the book that it's a much more unequal society now. People will openly tell you that they're almost proud to be poor. In Colombia, there's this saying, pobre pero feliz, so poor but happy. Being less judged, to be frank, I feel like it's even worse in Latin America than here in the United States. I mean, it's hard to quantify, but it is the case that when you live in a situational place with a much higher degree of inequality, people are going to be more sensitive to that. So the more middle class Anglosphere, which had less inequality, built more of a natural aristocracy and just, in my view, healthy community. Whereas I don't know if Latin America's ever really had that. Now, if you go to the rural communities within their own villages or whatever, I think they would have a lot of kind of kinship and less emphasis on wealth. But the cities are a different matter. And unfortunately, that's where most of the tourists or, the Anglos or, Americans would go. And so they wouldn't really get to interact with these long-term communities, and it would be very hard for them to integrate anyway. Yeah.
Another, I guess, controversial topic.
Yeah.
Real quick, you bring up IQ. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I bring it up, mate, and I'm glad. I mean, I'm not afraid to talk about it because people call you names, but the truth is, everyone knows it's true, right? If you just look at the numbers, it's well documented that Latin America suffers from, relative to Canada and the United States. So there are other parts of the world that have much worse problems in this regard, but Latin America does suffer from much lower average national IQ than Canada and the United States, and it's not a trivial difference. So the only countries that crack 90 on average IQ are Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Uruguay having the highest from memory. And then Costa Rica is on the cusp of around 89 or something like that. If you have, and this is well documented, and I should have brought this book for the discussion, but if you have a low IQ population, you're going to have an extremely difficult time developing. And building anything is going to be tough, like building the ZEDEs in Honduras. So and there's all sorts of research, and I don't know whether you've read that chapter in detail because it's one of the most important chapters of the book. And I give more further resources on this. There's a book, Hive Mind, by Garrett Jones, an economics professor at George Mason University, which goes into great detail. And he even mentions the issue of race in IQ, which is I'm shocked that he got away with that in the academic world. He didn't really touch upon it himself. He just kind of mentioned other people who've talked about it, kind of just like hinting at it. But in my opinion, if you don't address the chronic low IQ in Latin America, all the other talk is just talk. I just feel like how many countries with IQs of 85 or lower or whatever are first world or developed? I mean, maybe some in the Middle East that are just sitting on oil and have some kind of like royal family that keeps everyone in line. There might be some tiny examples like that, but there's a very strong correlation between economic development and the intelligence of a nation. And so to me, anyone who's really concerned about Latin America's violence, pollution, corruption, low productivity, has to just take that real fundamental problem head on. Unless you're willing to do that, you're just, I don't know, just enjoying your pitter-patter or chatter with other academics who want to sound fancy. And I know it's not an easy thing to talk about, but to me, there are lots of ways to fix this or address it. It doesn't have to all be genetic. I mean, of course, there is a genetic component, but I say that the big challenge is that the very smartest people are leaving Latin America all the time. And that is just, it is a brain drain, and you're making the problem worse. So it's a kind of a downward spiral. That's why places like Nicaragua and Cuba are just destroyed now. But I just say, look, you've got to deal with terrible water, terrible pollution, bad nutrition, people not even doing proper breastfeeding, or having bad nutrition when the babies are in the womb. All these things that lower your intelligence, and I hope that. I'm sure there are other people who have mentioned this, but in book form, I'm pretty much the only one who's discussed this in the Latin American context, as far as I know. I just think it's a crucial piece of the puzzle, and anyone who cares about Latin America has to face up to it. And the good news is that, one, there are real sort of practical policies that can address this, and two, that many of the Latin Americans I know personally are quite open to this discussion. And they would, of course, there's some who get offended or whatever. It's a bit like this Latinx or Latinx or whatever name for Latinos. No Latinos care about the word Latino. They don't care. Most of them would say, yes, we can see that we have a lacking in IQ, like our education is not good enough or whatever it may be. Let's work on it, right? But it's the people up in the United States and Canada that seem to get all their knickers in a twist about it. And I just say, you've got to face up to it and address it. And like I said, in my view, most Latinos, I've got tons of friends across the region who would agree with me about this and want to address it. And they would agree with me, especially about the brain drain, about how there's a real problem long term.
Yeah, I think a lot of people I know would agree. And I'm just as an example. I was hanging out with some my Mexican friends, I guess a couple days ago, and I specifically asked them, because people bring this up in the chats and online, and what do Mexicans think about Trump having been elected? And I asked Mexicans, like, so what do you guys think about Trump now being president? And they said, yeah, we think it's great. It's like, I mean, they look at it all realistically. They view it as the least worst. They're like Kamala and Biden. They were this woke, insane, communist, liberal globalism, and they're like, at least Trump, will bring back sense of normalcy. So this is Mexicans telling me directly, like, we're okay with Trump. Like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, this border stuff. It's just common sense stuff that we all would agree on. Let me ask you then about, you've got this great chapter, Americans have nowhere to escape to. Third world's superficial appeal does not beat land of the free. And so, especially with COVID 1984, as I call it, a lot of people fled. A lot of people fled Canada, USA, Europe. They came down to Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Panama, different places. I've met some of my listeners who fled. I've consulted with some folks, and I generally tell people that sometimes it's best to stay where you're at. Don't just follow the trend to leave just for the sake of leaving. But your sort of thoughts on America being like the last stand?
Yeah, I mean, there are many different ways to attack that question, because, of course, the United States, there's a big difference between the U.S. federal government in Washington, D.C., which is basically an imperial city, and the people of Wyoming, which are just up the road from me. And that's a real dichotomy. They're just worlds apart. So if you think coming to the United States is going to mean you can just avoid taxes and avoid these stupid government agencies, well, that's wrong, right? Because you've got this nut job, Social Security system, which is a Ponzi scheme, that's a big scam. And you have all sorts of federal agencies which are just out of control. And the US has had real black marks on its name. So the Ruby Ridge incident was famous back in the 90s. Waco was famous, where basically the US federal government just threw its weight around and killed a bunch of people that it really didn't have to kill. Okay. Now, also, I should make clear that for people like you and me who don't have deep roots in the United States, it makes a lot more sense to move to Latin America, because we're not giving up as much, right? I mean, I have almost no relatives here. I mean, there are no real roots for me here. So, okay. But put it this way. I gave a speech up in Canada about this, because Canadians are all thinking about where to flee to. And I've got another book for Canadians, but if you're concerned about a classical liberal view of freedom, which would be almost like a right libertarian form of freedom, where you focus on property rights and freedom of association and low regulation, judicial stability, whatever, and not so much on the kind of like, I don't know, progressive freedom. It's not an accident, or it is clear that the very best countries, and I note the top 12 in another chapter are all either Northwestern European, British colonies, or a couple of East Asian countries, which basically have either replicated or kind of copied our ways of doing things. In the case of Japan, they got bombed by the US and then going to have to go through a US rebuilding. But now, anywhere you go outside of that, you're going to suffer from challenges like inflation and corrupt courts and all these things that impede a long-term view of things. So if you want to consider going to Latin America, you have to realize that first, yes, there is more of a black market, and yes, maybe some rules are not applied as strictly. So if you go to Guatemala, you can just buy whatever drug you want basically on the street or even at a pharmacy. You don't need to get prescriptions or whatever. But the big challenge is in the long term. If you have a family, what kind of jobs are your children going to get in the future? What kind of education are they going to get? What kind of values are they going to learn? If you grow your business beyond, let's say, $500,000 a year, you're going to be a target. Even lower than that, because you're going to stand out. So your safety, there are all sorts of challenges that don't meet the eye. So there's more, because if you go to Guatemala, for example, super low cost of living, no tax on foreign income. I mean, it sounds like a dream, right? Then you find out that whenever you want to import anything, they'll charge you a crazy tax at the airport, right? Or, they'll kind of shaft you in other ways. But I just think that a lot of people go to Latin America, do so, and not you personally, I mean, you've got experience, you've traveled the world, you've got a much more broader understanding. They do so, in my opinion, with a superficial or a shallow understanding of the region, and they're not thinking so much intergenerationally. And it's not an accident that most of the children of the oligarchs I know now live outside of Latin America. They'll live in the UK or Canada or the US or Australia or somewhere like that. And that's really tough, and I know even one of my good friends in Panama, who I guess is like a gringo Panamanian, if you want to call him that, his children now live in the United States. And so that's my personal observation too, that people go, but they don't really stay. And I mean, the future, who knows what's going to happen in the future of the United States, because we can get off on different tangents, but it is the case that the kind of pioneer stock of Canada and the United States, the ones, like I said, the real heartland people of the prairies and the mountain states, are overrun. They're outnumbered now. So how long things like free speech and gun rights will last in the United States, which are most kind of like foundational freedoms of this country, I don't know. My chapter on that just said that there are two main reasons why the United States is still the place to be. One, you have this is an easy one for everybody. You have a much more diverse and lucrative economy. So even if you live in Mexico, you're probably going to want to sell your products to Americans who can pay more. And then second, you do have a more self-governing or self-ruling population. It's only incrementally better, but it still is there. And especially if you structure your life, you can go and move to, yes, the mountain states or Wyoming, or New Hampshire, or maybe places like Tennessee, Kentucky, whatever. They would have more of a kind of like freedom mentality, and in a way that would fit with a family. They're not all just kind of like, they're more of a kind of like I said, kind of like a right libertarian, classical liberal mentality, which is what many of us are looking for, especially as we grow older. And you think about it too. I always say that in general, I believe in human rationality, and you got to ask yourself, okay, if people are making rational decisions, who actually moves to Latin America right now? It tends to be retirees on fixed incomes. It tends to be independent entrepreneurs like yourself who can kind of really, have more initiative and kind of like really respond well and learn. It'll be some hippies who want to go and smoke it up, in Panajachel in Guatemala or whatever. And it's not the ambitious venture capitalists. It is not the well-trained doctors or lawyer. They're not doing it. Forget it, right? And it's not the people with tight long-term paths. Now, there are cases of some, I've spoken I can speak for a long time about this question, but there are cases of some religious groups just uprooting and moving to Paraguay or Guatemala or whatever. Those are rare instances, and in some ways they might make sense too.
Yeah, I just want to add again the exceptions, and just recently they opened a supermarket targeting the wealthy in my neighborhood. I mean, where we live,
good.
We've got the Sorianas, which is for like the lower class. The Walmart is like middle class, and then and we were there yesterday. There was a Cybertruck parked in the garage, and you can see these are they're millionaires, and it's right next to the huge gated community. It's 5 minutes away. It's the Mexican millionaires. I mean, I've been in that gated complex, and I would just say, and some of the students that I've known, some of them I see on LinkedIn. They work for they're in photos with Trudeau. They're working for U.S. State Department, but I also see them here. I mean, some of them do end up staying, and I would just argue that you can carve out exceptions, but again, there's a bit of nuance there.
Well, we have this one thing I should say, mate. I don't know how long we've been speaking, but there is disruption coming to Latin America. That technology really is disrupting Latin American society. So whether it's cell phones or just even getting cheaper automobiles, because when I first went in 2010, you still saw horses all over the place. That is much rarer.
I still do see horses. So.
Okay, good. Yeah, but the big change to me, which not enough people talk about, is the loss of the strong Latin American family. Because it just, whether we like it or not, once people reach a certain level of income or well-being, especially women, they have fewer children. It's an unfortunate reality, but Latin America is going through a huge demographic reawakening right now, where they have fewer children, and the sort of traditional stereotypes and gender roles and families are coming apart. And I don't know where this is going to lead. I think it's an uncertain time for Latin America's future, and I think probably it'll create problems and probably more of a diaspora. But it is the case that Latin America is changing now and taking on many of the worst aspects of Western society.
Yeah, I've noticed amongst our sort of secular middle class Mexican friends, they tend to have one child, basically, or two. Sure. Part of it's economy because both parents are working, and just one child. I think another part is religious. In our church, a whole bunch of people have 3, 4, 5 kids. One of our friends is now going to be on their 6th kid, and so I think those are different values also, that trend is true. I guess one of my last questions I do want to ask you is something that one of the topics I'm obsessed with often is the sort of social credit system that's coming to the West now. People are getting debanked for thought crime. You see it in UK and Canada. The truckers, the DHS has taken me off of PayPal. And
are you serious?
Yeah, two years ago. So I can't use for thought crime, right? And so I mean, you spoke to that earlier. How there's this increased attack on free speech and gun rights and all that. We see this in the Western world. Yeah. But I guess my question would be: a lot of people see places like Latin America, where you can buy time from that. Like people argue that it will be more difficult to implement, these digital IDs and cashless systems in places like Mexico. I'm not so sure because sometimes they can use what they call leapfrog technology. And you see the government trying to implement that stuff here in Mexico. What are your thoughts on how effectively sort of a dystopian technocracy could be implemented in Mexico or Latin America?
Yeah, mate, gosh, we could speak on for a long time, mate. I really have enjoyed hearing your questions or insights. It's great. This is a fact that it's not an accident that many of the most penetrating or incisive journalists, researchers devoted to the West no longer live in the West. So Glenn Greenwald lives in Brazil. You have, I can't remember his name, but a long-time guy who lives in Japan. And many people have spoken about moving to Russia, of all places. I agree that if you want to be criticizing a regime that does not control you, so it's kind of easy for me to trash Canada, or not trash Canada, but attack the Ottawa ruling class in Canada from the United States. This few things get me angrier. I mean, many things get me frustrated, I guess, but one thing that gets me seriously angry is this cancel culture. And I just resist this. I realize that I pay a heavy price for it. I will pay a heavy price for it. But I wish that more people had the kind of courage to just speak their minds, because it's much harder to take on 50 million Americans than just 20, whatever it may be. And but it is true that people who have these progressive dogmas, right, they are incredibly vindictive and sensitive to people challenging their worldview. I mean, it's like a harsh religion. I mean, and if you go off the reservation, they will attack you. And the most brazen example was in Canada with the trucker convoy, where these truckers raised maybe $20 million. I mean, a huge amount of money to support their cause. And then the crowdfunding sites couldn't disperse the money because, one, the bank accounts of the main leaders of this trucker convoy were frozen, and the actual crowdfunding sites themselves were threatened with, penalties if they were to release the money, disperse the funds. That was a real wake-up call to Canadians. So in that regard, I actually agree with you that if you set up shop in Chile or Brazil or whatever and start writing about the crimes of the U.S. bureaucracy, I mean, what are they going to do to you?
Yeah, and many Mexicans, I mean, there's the high number of Mexican journalists being whacked within Mexico. I know some have fled to USA, but I mean, that speaks to what you're talking about. And just the second part of my question, though, do you think these sort of technocracy digital control systems can be applied in places like Mexico, Latin America, or will be kind of like the Honduras thing where...
No, I don't think they can be applied. But what can be applied is more what you touched upon with the killings of the journalists, is that more kind of like a local caudillo or almost like warlord justice. But if you're just paying, I mean, you could even go live in Cuba, whatever, wherever. If you're just writing about foreign topics, I don't think they really care. I mean, what does it hurt them? So I haven't, I do have 3 passports and I can leave. So I'm just like you. Maybe I'm harder to attack. I'm more mobile. I can escape persecution. But I realize why Americans, and this really breaks my heart, many of them agree with me on so many topics, but just won't say it. I went to a very politically incorrect conference recently. It was packed. There might have been 500 people there. You weren't allowed to take photos because people are trying to preserve their anonymity. I'm going, what? I was going, this is so frustrating. People should know that we think this way or whatever, and yet we're kind of like all hiding in the shadows. But I know that Americans can't do it because these days, if you want to get a job in academia or teaching or, I mean, even like you said, even the banks are cutting you down now. So it is clear that some people want, in my view, petty and vindictive, can't handle alternative perspectives, and they're my enemies. And I find they're enemies of truth, enemies of open dialogue. We have them here in the United States and Canada. They've captured many institutions, and that's why they find any kind of free speech platform a grave threat.
Yeah, I'm more of the burn the boats mentality. I don't care anymore.
What is that?
Like burn the boats, burn the bridges. I don't care. And I mean, I've lived in the yurt. I could always go back to the Gobi Desert and continue. Like if the worst comes to worst. But we've covered a lot. There's more in your book. There's a lot of chapters. Some of them are pretty brief. But any other thought or final thought for us?
Well, of course, I would love people to buy my book, The Latin America Red Pill. Please check it out on Amazon. And as you say, some of the chapters are short. It's the book is around 370 pages, about 40 pages of references. And, if I were to do it again, I'd probably make it even shorter just because people have, we all have short attention spans. But I couldn't touch on everything. And I had other chapters to include. I did keep the chapters relatively short. A few of them are over 2,000 words, but most of them, just hold there a second, I'm getting a call. Most of them are, I don't know, around 1,000 words. Yeah, so pretty digestible. But I mean, if people like it, don't like it, please let me know. I'm writing my next book and I'd love to have feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't find it very long to read. Again, I've got the Kindle version here, Latin America, Red
Sure.
Pill. So all of your links are in the description, so people can follow you on all your channels as well, and get the book. So it was great chatting with you. Thank you, Fergus.
Thank you, sir.